Unless you have been under a rock, you have seen the headlines about Britney Spears' ongoing battle with her father over the 13-year conservatorship imposed by a Los Angeles court, which gives her father pretty much complete control over her finances and her life. Now, Britney wants out, and recently she told the court that she was afraid of her father, who she has accused of conservatorship abuse. Today, we're asking what's going on with Brittany's case and her dad. And we're also asking what are the best practices for parenting in the 21st century? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Britney Spears won a big victory in court recently when a Los Angeles Superior Court judge allowed her to pick her own attorney in her 13-year conservatorship battle with her father. What does this mean for Britney's case, and why is what happened to Britney so important for millions of people across the country? Here with answers is my good friend, attorney, and legal analyst, Sarah Azari. Welcome back to the show, Sarah. You know, all of these headlines about Britney, but help us understand how we got here. What happened to Britney Spears some 13 years ago?
Yeah, Areva, so, 13 years ago, she had a mental breakdown. I think we all remember those images of her with the shaved head, breaking into a car. That's the million-dollar question of why over the course of these 13 years, when she's been performing on the international stage, she's been performing in Vegas day and night, is she really in need of a conservator? Can she just take care of herself after all these years? Because you can have, you can need a conservator at some point in time, but your mental health gets monitored by the probate court, and at some point you're always able to go in and terminate the conservatorship. So the problem here is that we only know what you show, and these proceedings have been sealed. They've been largely confidential. We don't know what her mental health has been like over these years, and whether the conservatorship was warranted to be continued. On the other hand, we also don't know to what extent her former counsel, the court-appointed attorney, maybe dropped the ball. I mean, she has never formally petitioned the removal of her father. She's come to court a number of times complaining, with sort of like a checklist of why he should be removed. But as you know, the proper protocol is a petition, and she has the burden of proof of proving these allegations about abuse, about being unfit. So she's never formally done that. And you got to ask why. Why did this lawyer not do anything? To move the needle, legally speaking. So again, I think there's a lot we don't know in the record that might explain why this has gone on for so long.
Sarah, one of the things I want to do is help people understand typically how conservatorships work and the kinds of people that you typically see conserved, because I'm really disturbed by this case on a lot of different levels. And one is that there's this notion that somehow because you have a mental illness that you are someone that needs to be conserved, because we know, 30% or more of Americans suffer from some kind of mental health issue, and they are not, the typical person who has a mental health issue is getting medication, they're getting therapy, they're getting, support for their illness, and they're not being taken into court by their relatives saying that I should have complete control over them. So how are conservatorships typically, administered, in our court system? Who's likely to be in a conservatorship?
Well, the likely candidate is usually the incapacitated older person nearing the end of their life. That's typically what you see. But then unfortunately, and I've had this with my own clients who have been in conservatorship, and much like Britney, I've wondered whether they really need it. It's this idea of, imposing a permanent conservatorship on somebody that maybe has a mental breakdown, and nothing, as you know, is permanent in a court of law. You can always petition, and the law is supposed to recognize changed circumstances. But by by this definition, and Britney's case is not unprecedented. There are thousands of cases like hers across the nation. People are locked into this conservatorship arrangement merely because they have wealth. And it's like, if there's guardianship and money, there's often greed. And that's what's so dangerous about this. And that's why it's so important, because, like you said, it also stigmatizes mental health to some extent. The idea that you might need medication, you might need therapy, but you don't need a conservator. And so, the way that this works is there's a petition made to the court, there's a mental health evaluation. The court then determines that you are unable to care for yourself. But that idea of the inability to care for yourself is not really what you and I and most people think about. The court sees it differently. The idea of vulnerability and being able to be influenced, the danger of that when you have wealth is something that the court recognizes and I think defines far broader than what you and I and most of the public consider. So, the petition's made, the mental health evaluation's done, and then the court determines that you do need a conservator, and then the actions of that conservator or conservators is very closely monitored during the course of that conservatorship. So to some extent, Areva, there's a lot of oversight in this process, and there's a lot of individuals involved. There's the personal conservator, there's the fiscal conservator, there is the mental health person. And so there's a lot of checks and balances to some extent. And that's what sort of makes me question whether Jamie Spears has been able to get away with a level of abuse that has gone unnoticed. I don't know.
Yeah, we know Jamie is Britney's dad. We know that Britney has accused her father of conservatorship abuse. And we know that the personal conservator, Jody Montgomery, has accused him of spending almost $2 million to lawyers in order for those lawyers to keep him in place as the conservator. I know you have a criminal law background, Sarah. New lawyer has been brought into this case for Britney, one that she's been able to select on her own. If this new lawyer goes through these files and determines that there's been some shenanigans going on with respect to this $60 million estate, could Jamie Spears or anyone else that's been involved in this case face potential criminal charges?
Absolutely. Look, there's civil and criminal liability, and the two are not mutually exclusive. The idea here is that, parents have an inherent conflict of interest to be the conservator of their children. In this particular case, this is a man who at some point was profiting from the tours. So those tours that Britney was referencing in one of her addresses to the court, saying that she had a high fever and she was forced to perform, you got to wonder, is that the worst kind of conflict of interest, where your father is forcing you to perform and meanwhile he's getting a percentage of your profits from that tour? There is something there with this guy, and those millions of dollars that were spent on lawyers. Guess who's paying for those? Britney Spears. So, abuse it's under the Welfare and Institutions Code, and abuse can take the form of physical, mental, emotional, and of course financial. And if what determines the difference between criminal and civil abuse is really the mens rea, is the intent, the level of egregiousness involved. And so more shall be revealed. To the extent that he has abused his authority as a conservator, he might face civil liability, in which case he would be sanctioned. Number one, he would be removed as a conservator. He would be sanctioned and possibly ordered to return some of the monies that were perhaps misappropriated as a result of that abuse. And if that rises to the level of a criminal intent, he could certainly also be prosecuted under the Welfare and Institutions Code.
Yeah, we know Britney has come out and said she's not going to perform anymore as long as her father is, serving as a conservator. So she's cutting off the spigot. She's cutting off, the money that is keeping this whole operation afloat. And we know that Britney has told the court that she wants to end the conservatorship without a mental examination. And I would imagine, and I'm sure you do, that her new lawyer, one of the things he's going to be doing forthwith is filing some kind of petition with the court, a formal petition to terminate this conservatorship. How likely is it that a court will terminate a conservatorship without a mental health examination by some kind of psychiatrist or psychologist? Do you think that's, possible in this case?
No, it's highly unlikely. So what will happen, and I think her lawyer made that clear, her new attorney, who's, by the way, a pit bull, working for a big firm, former federal prosecutor, I happen to know him from other cases, he is going to first petition the removal of Jamie Spears, because for as long as her father is in place as a conservator, the needle won't move. A conservatorship can sometimes come to an end through collaboration by the parties, an agreement to a particular mental health expert to evaluate her as a final step, a care plan for her. These are things that are far more easier, I should say, to reach termination if you can work together, as opposed to a highly opposed type of petition. And so the first step is to remove him, because then things will become a lot easier towards, with respect to the termination step. And then it would be, the petition to terminate. And again, if the parties can come to an agreement, then that will be much easier. But she absolutely has to have a mental health evaluation. Perhaps that can be done, much like now she finally has an attorney of her choice. Maybe that can be done through selection of a mental health expert where both sides agree to that person. She has had no trust in the people that have evaluated her, that have overseen her conservatorship, that have represented her as attorneys. She's had no say, she's had no trust. And so finally she has the lawyer of her choice, and perhaps that lawyer can then bring in other players of her choice that the other side agrees to work towards termination. With him in place, it's not going to happen.
I'm so glad you mentioned that care plan, because that's one of the things that really troubles me as a lawyer about this case. Is 13 years. What has been done over those 13 years to get her prepared? Even if you believe 13 years ago she was, mentally incapacitated in a way that she couldn't take care of her finances and her, personal decisions, seemingly over 13 years, these worldwide tours, this Las Vegas residency, being a judge on the X Factor, all of these things demonstrate some level of competency. And, you're thinking, where is the care plan to get this young woman to a point where she can be responsible for herself? And it bothers me because, the mental health aspect of it, to suggest that someone who has a mental health issue should be conserved is, I think, really problematic for the millions of people that suffer from mental health issues. I got to let you go, but I want to ask you this last question, Sarah. Britney's been invited to testify before Congress. Not sure that the person that invited her is looking out for her best interest as much as wanting to get on this big publicity train. But put that aside. Let's assume
exactly
there. How can this case have national implications? How can it help shine a light on what may be other cases where folks aren't as wealthy, aren't as famous as Britney, but yet find themselves trapped in a conservatorship that has some questions about its legitimacy? Do you think this case?
I think that's the significance of this case. When I hear pundits say it's unprecedented, it's not unprecedented. It's notorious, and I think that's what's important, is that Britney has the power of using her celebrity to make some changes, maybe in the law, but maybe in the way that courts handle these situations. These are supposed to be last resorts, and they have now become first resorts. They're very easily granted. Maybe the incompetence or mental illness doesn't rise to that level of not being able to care for yourself. But when there's wealth, the court is more inclined to order them, and people are trapped in them because of the individuals that get involved in as conservators, as experts in these cases. And so I think her case is, and that's why I like to speak about this case, is the significance of her ability and her celebrity to call the attention, much needed attention, to how these cases are handled. They're easily granted, and they're so challenging to terminate.
Yeah. No, it's a really great point. And, speaking of the money involved, I think I read someplace that the lawyer that's been representing her was getting over $500,000 a year So, I mean, that's just one client where he's, drawing $500,000 just on her case. And you have to question, what were you doing every year for $500,000?
Exactly. As a court-appointed attorney. Yeah.
Court-appointed attorney that, most court-appointed attorneys probably, have never made that much in the entire time they've been working for the courts.
Right.
But thanks, Sarah, for your voice on this.
Areva.
Keep us apprised. We're going to be following this case, obviously. Can't wait to see what that pit bull of a lawyer does, and hopefully he brings this young woman to a place where she can be free from this court appointed oppression. Good word. Good word. Thanks. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you soon, my friend.
Thanks, Areva. Have a great day.
Okay, take care. All right, we're moving on. My next guest is Dr. Bridget Vittrup. She is a developmental psychologist, and she's a professor at Texas Women's University. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Vittrup.
Good morning. Thank you.
So, Dr. Vittrup, we were talking in that first segment about Britney Spears. Obviously, when you talk about parenting, Britney Spears' dad has been in the news a great deal. He has refused to step down as conservator, even though she has accused him of abuse. She says she's afraid of him. It just seems like a really toxic relationship and a bad idea for a parent to be a conservator over a child. Do you think there's some inherent issues? I know Sarah talked about the legal issues of conflict of interest, but what about from a developmental standpoint and from a parent-child relationship standpoint? Do you think this is a good idea?
No, I think it leaves it open for a lot of problems because in a quote unquote normal parent-child relationship, we take care of our children until they're of legal age, and it's our job to make sure that we raise them to be able to function independently and be able to take care of themselves. And so when you enter into this conservatorship, essentially what you're doing is you're artificially extending this child-adult relationship where all of a sudden this person who's now an adult is being forced into this relationship where they're essentially functioning as a child who doesn't have the legal rights or the ability to take care of themselves. And I think especially in the case of a mental breakdown, as you were talking to Sarah about, that it's not necessarily something that needs to go on forever for one mental breakdown, that really what we need is mental health intervention and not for parents to come in and force this parent-child relationship to where they can't do anything on their own. I think it's important that we let them be adults and function as adults, even though we're still their parent. And then also it impedes the further development and mental health if you're forcing them to be in that relationship.
Yeah, and I just wrote an article about this. And again, as a mental health advocate, it really bothers me because I think somehow people are getting the impression that because you have, as you said, one mental breakdown, that somehow you are forever incapable of taking care of yourself. And we do know that there are tremendous advances that have been made with respect to mental health. There are interventions that can be made. And it just bothers me that we haven't seen more in terms of a care plan to get her to that point where she can be self-sustaining and self-sufficient. And I definitely want people to know, and as a psychologist, I'm glad you're here to help people also get this message that if you have a mental health condition, does not mean that you are forever incapable of, or that you are incapacitated, that there is help out there, and hopefully Britney gets the help that she needs, and anyone else that finds themselves in this position also gets that help. I want to move on though, Dr. Vittrup, you've done a lot of work around a subject that's really, really important to me, and that's anti-racism work, and particularly around kids. And I discovered you because of the work you've done around how to raise kids who are anti-racist. Help us understand what some of the research is showing now about how parenting in the 21st century has to take into account and consideration subjects of race.
I think it's always been important, but I think people haven't recognized that it's important to bring up these issues and to talk about them. And what we see is that, especially among white families, is that there has not been a whole lot of discussion about it, because as a white person, race is not something that's very salient on a regular basis, whereas for people of color, it's something that they're constantly being reminded of, the fact that they're judged because of the color of their skin. And so I think it's very important. Research is showing that kids are already starting to show these biases already at preschool age, because they look around them and they see what's in society, they see what's in the media. There's a lot of stereotypes, biases, misrepresentations, biased representations, and then they just look around and see a society where the people in power are white, and the people of the lower status jobs and less successful are people of color. And so it influences how they see the world. It influences children of color, how they perceive themselves and their opportunities later in life. And it also influences white children in terms of how they see other people of color. And so it's important as parents to be aware of that. And especially these days with the constant 24/7 media influence, as kids have so much access to media, it's even more important that we address these issues with our kids.
And Dr. Bishop, you hear a lot of parents say that their kids don't see color, that their kids are color blind, and that their kids, will play with anyone on the playground, Black, Latino, Asian. Your research says that's false, that kids aren't color blind.
They're not, because society is not colorblind. Kids see everything around them, and there are so many both direct and indirect messages telling them that they learn so early on that race is an important distinguishing category, and they start paying attention to that. And so I think it's well intended that the parents, we see it especially among white parents, that they want their kids to be colorblind and they perceive their kids to be colorblind. Again, what they see is that, well, my kid will play with kids of other colors on the playground. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not developing these biases based on what they're seeing. And so what I've heard a lot of parents say is that, well, it's not really an issue. We'll talk about it if it comes up. But the problem is that, again, a lot of times within white families, but you see it in some families of color too, is that there's sort of this silence around the topic of race. And for a lot of people, it's because they're uncomfortable with it. They did not grow up talking about race, and so they don't really know how to address it. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so kids learn that this is not something we talk about. And so then they're essentially left to figure all of this out all on their own. And that's part of the problem. Essentially what we're doing is we're just preserving the status quo. We're not doing anything to address the inequalities that exist. And in order to move forward, we do have to acknowledge it, because otherwise we're sort of silently approving what's going on.
And I guess some of the research shows that it's as early as 3 months that kids are recognizing color and making differentiating people of color. I want to talk about, obviously not talking about it is not something that you as a developmental psychologist would recommend. In fact, you're saying that parents should be talking about race. And I would imagine you would say that should start as early as possible, as long as those conversations are developmentally appropriate for the kid at that age. So give us an example of what you might say to a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old about the subject of race if you are a white parent.
So I oftentimes advise parents to use books or videos as springboards, and that's oftentimes because it can feel kind of unnatural to just sit down and start talking about it out of the blue if that's not something that you normally talk about in your family. But there are a lot of really great books out there that you could choose for various age groups. I mean, even with my own kids, we started with these books that there's one that's called Shades of People. There's another book about how we got our skin color. And so you use these books to start conversations about, what is skin color and what makes us who we are. And there are all these people of different shades. And as they get older, you can start these conversations about how some people are being judged differently, or they're not being treated the same because of the color of their skin. What do you think about that? And so kids, even very young kids, understand concepts of fairness and being nice and treating people well. And so you could put it in that context when they're really young. about this fairness of how people are being treated. And then as they get older, bringing these conversations about bias and discrimination when they start to be able to understand stereotypes and point it out when something happens in their shows. You know, have you noticed that there's hardly any people of color in this TV show? Why do you think that is? And do you think that's fair? And really use these videos, TV shows for older kids, stories in the news. I mean, even younger kids are being exposed to stories in the news because it's on 24/7. And so use these as springboards and bring in these conversations. And it's not just a one-time conversation. These should be things that you talk about continuously.
And beyond those conversations and beyond bringing out books and, you know, sitting down with your kids when they're watching certain television shows, what else should parents be doing, again, in this concept of trying to raise children who are anti-racist? You know, is there anything else that you would recommend that parents do that's proactive?
I think it's important, to the extent possible, to expose them to other environments. What we see is that neighborhoods in the US are very segregated. I mean, they're actually even more segregated now than they were before Brown versus Board of Education. And so kids oftentimes grow up in neighborhoods where they just see people that look like them. They don't see people that look differently. And so I think it's important, if you can go to other areas, go to events in a different neighborhood, you know, go to, you know, different cultural celebrations, learn about other people's history and experiences so that the kids have these experiences. And one thing that I've talked to some parents about also is just this concept of pen pals, and having pen pals in different countries or just even different parts of the world, people that are different, where they can learn about each other. It improves writing skills. It's almost a lost form because now we're just, you know, abbreviated text messages and everything is on FaceTime. But so that they can establish these relationships with people that are different from them. Because you do see that kids that have grown up in environments that are very diverse, and kids that have friends of different racial, ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, they tend to show fewer biases.
I want to bring to the conversation now Anasia Obeoha. She is the mother of a 3-year-old son, and she also has a 5-month-old daughter. Good morning, Anasia. How are you?
Good morning, Areva. I'm well. How are you?
Good. So Anasia is a doctoral student. She's a diversity and inclusion expert, and she's a mother of 2 small kids. And one of the conversations I don't think you can have when you're talking about parenting, Dr. Vitra, particularly when you're talking about African-American parents, is the talk that we hear so much about. Anasia, you have a 3-year-old son. Have you given a lot of thought to when you're going to talk to your son about these issues of race, police brutality, you know, the reality of being a Black man in America and some of the challenges that he's likely to face?
Absolutely. And it's already, the conversations are already starting right now, not with my son at 3 years old because he's too young to really understand it, but I'm already having conversations with his teachers and different administrators at the school. So an example is my son was recently diagnosed with mild autism. And so because of that, he was running into some situations at school where they were saying that he was having behavioral problems. And I had to make sure that he was diagnosed, and I wanted them to know that this is beyond just behavioral problems, because when I'm reading that 24% of African American students are suspended compared to 8% of white students, that means that they're punished and that they are being held accountable for these things. So I'm letting his teachers know, I'm talking to administrators, I'm letting them know that, you know, it's far beyond my son just not paying attention, or, you know, that he's not wanting to follow direction. We're actually changing schools. Because of it, we're putting him in Culver City School District because they do have people who are able to help students that, you know, have some deficiencies. And they're working with him on advising, they're having a plan set for him. So it's really important to me because when I'm reading the research and I see what's going on, especially as it relates to African-American boys, I want to make sure that we stay ahead of the game.
Well, first of all, you know, thank you for sharing, you know, something so personal about your son. And as you know, here at the Special Needs Network, we just have a myriad of services. So we look forward to being able to welcome you into the Special Needs Network family. Make sure you get all the support that you need in terms
Thank you.
of IEPs and access to doctors and all the services for your son. But Dr. Vitrop, she raises a really important point. Even before we get to the talk about Black boys going out into the world having to deal with police, you have this whole issue of what happens to Black kids in school as early as preschool, her son's age, where they are often labeled because of certain behaviors that often leads them to being overrepresented in special education classes, leads them to being overrepresented in the kids who are disciplined and later suspended. What do you think in terms of parenting, again, in this day and age? So a young parent like Anasia needs to be, she's obviously very smart, very educated, and on top of things, but a lot of parents wouldn't necessarily have access to the research that she has.
Yeah, I think it's very important for parents to be aware of that and to be proactive and be advocates for their children, because it really is what we see statistically, that this is how they're being labeled. And it's also part of the reason why you see that, they run into issues with then academic success, because they're being labeled from so early on. And so then they don't believe in themselves anymore. Teachers don't challenge them as much because they've already been labeled as, the difficult or the challenging kid with behavioral issues. And so I think also communication between the parent and the teacher, communication with the school, the more information you can give the teachers and the school administration about your child and anything they might experience. Because what you see sometimes also is that kids of color who are actually quite gifted, and they end up getting bored at school. And so then they get fidgety and they start doing stuff. And so then they get labeled as, problem children. And really it's because they're not being challenged. But that's not, part of it is because the teachers are given these reports that are oftentimes statistics taken out of context, where it just shows they're more likely to have behavioral issues, kids of color, and that they're more likely to, not be as successful. But it's part of this whole system of bias and prejudice and how we label them, and we're not giving them the right opportunities. So I think parents have to be very vigilant. But I also think white parents have a responsibility to teach their children and to engage in these conversations. School districts have a responsibility to provide more multicultural education sessions about this, and actually bring in parents to talk about their experiences in order for this to get better. Because in the teaching workforce, the majority of teachers are white, but the majority of the kids are kids of color. And so there's sort of this mismatch in experiences. And so the education is even more important, and the conversations. We have to have open conversations about this.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, Dr. Vitrop. Obviously, the issue of race and breaking down systemic barriers and dismantling systemic racism is not the job, the sole responsibility of Black families, Black parents. It's everyone's responsibility to work on creating a society that really values people of all colors and ethnicities. Anasia, social media, when my kids were growing up, obviously social media was available. They're young adults now, but they weren't bombarded with so many messages, every day, every time they turned on the computer. Are you worried about the messages that even your 3-year-old is being bombarded with from television and social media? And how do you manage it?
Absolutely. And, I agree with Dr. Vitrop. I actually was very selective in the school district that we chose for our son Elijah, because I wanted to make sure that he was around a diverse group of kids. And also I wanted to make sure that he was actually in a school system, because of the fact that, because people are home, a lot of their kids are spending more time on social media. So that kind of is that barrier. By keeping him in preschool and having him in a school environment, he's not on social media. He's not just sitting on a computer throughout the day, which, is not good for brain development. So that was a big reason we wanted to keep him in preschool. He's been in there throughout the entire pandemic. But as far as social media too, I just really monitor him. Now, he's not on social media at 3 years old. He's just, I'll, give him YouTube Kids, and then we have, different educational programs, like ABC Mouse, that we'll give him. And we just really monitor it, very closely, and we limit the amount of time he's on there. But the one benefit of being on social media as a parent is that I've been able to connect with so many other parents to be able to get information, and we can share advice with each other. We're able to connect with one another and get our kids together. So it's been a benefit in that way. My kid has many play dates with other boys. We can take them to the park. So it's been really good. I think it's a catch-22. There's good parts of the social media, and then there's not so good parts. It's all in a way that I think you manage it. So for my son, he knows that, come 2 hours, you're at your limit. No more, no more playing online, no more computer games. You're done for today.
What's your biggest fear as a mom? 2 kids, son and a daughter, growing up in this polarized world that we find ourselves in. What's your biggest fear as a parent?
My biggest fear as a parent, especially raising a young Black male, is, just him being stereotyped, him being categorized and looked at as a thug or a bad kid, because the media, especially the images that we see, oftentimes are not positive when it comes to Black males. And because of that, I think that, as much as we try to be good people, we all have some sort of unconscious biases. And so people, a lot of times, they have negative perceptions of Black males. And so my son's cute now because he's 3, but what are you going to think about him when he's 12? And, and we're in a predominantly white community. I want him to be able to walk down the street and people not assume that he's not supposed to be there. I don't want them to, the first thing that they think of him is something negative versus something positive. So that's a big fear of mine. Even right now, because of the pandemic, the kids they have to social distance. They're not able to, really be around each other and play with each other very closely. So I'm always concerned that my son will internalize that and think that, people don't want to play with him. It's not you, honey. It's just the way that we're doing things to be more safe these days. And I even explain that to him now. I never make him feel like, oh, you have to wear a mask because of something bad. I always say, oh, you're wearing a mask because you're being, sharing and caring to the next person and you want to protect them. So I try not to make it feel like there's anything wrong with him, but that's my fear. And I just try to channel that fear into something positive to make him know that he's great. He's a good kid. And, like what Dr. Vitrup said, he may be different in some areas, but they're not all bad things. Sometimes it's good things. Maybe it's just that he's learning so fast that he gets bored, so we try to stimulate him. And, that's the best thing that we could do. And I am an advocate of making sure that I have friends who are also parents that are all races so that my son is able to have experiences with different races like I did growing up. I grew up in one of the most diverse suburbs in Michigan called Oak Park. So I was around all people from white people, Black people, Hispanics, Jewish, Arabic, everything. So, I want my son to be exposed to that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, Aunt Asia. Always great to see you. You're my church friend.
Always great to see you too, Areva. And thank you so much, Dr. Vitrup.
Children are growing so beautifully. Thank you, Dr. Vitrup, for your work. Really love what you're doing and helping parents understand what their obligations and responsibilities are, in terms of we're going to change the world. We got to do it one parent at a time. So again, thanks to both of you for joining me this morning. Okay.
Thank you.
Our guest is Alfie Cohen. He's a former teacher, college professor, and outspoken critic of many conventional parenting methods. He's the author of 14 books, including Punished by Rewards and Unconditional Parenting. He writes and speaks widely on human behavior, education, and parenting. Good morning, Alfie, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
So we're talking about parenting, 21st century parenting, and I know, Alfie, you've been called the father of unconventional parenting. Tell us, what are the biggest mistakes that parents are making in terms of raising their kids?
Well, almost all parents are well-meaning, of course, love their children to death and, want the best for them. But it turns out that it's not enough just to love your children or even to love them a lot. What matters is whether we love them for who they are rather than for what they do. And the psychological research shows that kids need, for ideal flourishing to experience their parents' love as something that does not have strings attached, that can't be turned off if the kid screws up or falls short. That's what unconditional means. I love you no matter what. And it turns out that an awful lot of parenting advice we get in this country is the opposite of that. It's conditional parenting that says, I'm going to praise you or reward you when you jump through my hoops or impress me or please me. Or conversely, I'm going to do something that makes you suffer. Even if we don't call that a punishment, we prefer a euphemism like a consequence or holding kids accountable. The result is that these are both rewards and punishments are ways of doing things to children, generally to get them to obey mindlessly. Whereas it turns out that what's more consistent with most parents' long-term goals, and with what research shows is better, is what I call a working with approach. That's not about bribes and threats, but it's also not just based on getting compliance, but about helping kids to become independent thinkers, caring people who are happy and ethical and lifelong learners.
So a lot of what I've read in terms of your theories, Alfie, is things that a lot of parents use, like timeouts. You say, no, shouldn't be putting kids in that corner or going to sit in their room and having that time out. Give us an example of an alternative way, based on your theories, that a parent would handle a situation where a child has done something, I don't know, didn't finish their homework, didn't turn their homework in, did something for which there would be a timeout type consequence. What would your theory suggest happen?
Well, that's an interesting example because I've written another whole book called The Homework Myth.
I know you don't like homework.
Well, it turns out that homework is not only unnecessary but destructive, certainly up until high school, but that's a different conversation. What matters more than the specific thing we say and do at the time that the child does something that doesn't please us. Many parents looking desperately for a script or something, tell me where to stand and what to say and what tone of voice, is the overall continuous relationship we create with kids. Timeout, which started as a technique for suppressing certain...
I hear what you're saying about the broader principles, but help the parent that's sitting at home watching this who says, okay, I don't want to use timeouts. Tell us, from your perspective, your research, what are we going to use if we're not using timeouts? Right,
and that's what I'm in the process of trying to answer, is that the most important thing we've done is long before the kid does something that displeased us in terms of offering an unconditional support for kids along with our guidance. Now, when there's a problem, our specific response will depend on how old the child is, how developmentally capable, the reasons for why the child did what happened. What matters is not the behavior that you can see and measure, but the values and reasons and goals that underlie the reasons. So, for example, if a child says something nasty to her sister, that might have happened for any number of reasons, and each reason would call for a different set of responses from the parent. If it's a matter of the time of day when the kid's getting cranky, then we think about whether the child is being overstimulated at that time of day. If the child feels like, you think my sister is better for everything, you blame me, then we need to, the three of us, sit down and figure out where that impression is coming from and whether there may be some value to that. In many cases, what parents need to do is to talk less and ask more, to elicit the child's experience and why the child thinks this happened, and then bring the child in on the process of figuring out, what can we do here together to solve this problem and make sure that everybody's needs are met here, including having a look at the way your actions affected your sister or me. Unfortunately, when we use punishments or rewards of any kind, including praise, we get kids focused on the impact of the action only to themselves, All rewards and punishments, including praise and time out, according to the research, make kids more self-centered, less compassionate, because we're saying to them, you have to please me, the person with the power, for me to give you the sticker, the star, the good job. Or conversely, you have to avoid displeasing me, or I'm going to make your life miserable. That doesn't tend to work in the long run, even at getting compliance.
Let me ask you this, Alfie. So the praise that many parents like to really pour onto their kids, saying things like, I'm proud of you. You did a great job. You're an excellent tennis player. You're saying that kind of praise we should not be giving our kids?
I'm proud of you in general. I love you for who you are. The hugs, the smiles, all of that, of course, is terrific. But that must be without strings attached. When children get the message that they get the thumb up, the fist bump, the smile, the hug, the good job from us, only when they're good at sports, good at school, obedient, hide their negative emotions, thin, attractive, funny, smart, whatever it is, when there's a string attached to it, kids internalize that message and think, I am loved, apparently, and ultimately lovable only when I jump through the hoops and please the person.
So, Alfie, again, I'm trying to make this really concrete. I'm a lawyer, so I think in really black and white terms. So I'm trying to understand what you're saying. So kid graduates from college, they're summa cum laude, graduate, top of the class. Is it okay to say, gee, I am so proud of you and I just love you so much?
Well, a couple of distinctions there. Even black and white thinkers appreciate nuance, I know. One is saying that to a 22-year-old is different from saying it to a 10-year-old. Second, if our goal is for kids to understand that we love them no matter what, then we're going to be very careful, especially at a young age, about giving the message that I really love you and I'm impressed with you when you do well in school. One of the unforeseen and unfortunate implications, according to the research, of praising kids like, I really am proud of you that you got a good grade on your report card, is that makes kids less excited about learning. The research is very clear about this. When you praise or reward kids for doing well in school, they come to see doing well in school as just a means to an end, something they wouldn't want to do in its own right, something they now have to do to get that pat on the head from the parent. So if our goal is to help kids become lifelong learners and critical thinkers, for example, then when kids come home from school talking about what happened, we'd be more likely to engage them in conversation about what they're learning rather than how impressed an adult is about how well they're learning it. And we would do well to ask questions with kids. In college, to take your example, which courses did you not expect to be interesting that turned out to be interesting? Tell me something you figured out, which you can say to an 8-year-old, not just to an 18-year-old. Tell me something you figured out in school that was kind of new to you and interesting. Engaging kids and supporting their autonomy and their curiosity helps to cement our relationship with them, helps to support their sense of as a competent, confident person, even when they screw up, and helps to promote their excitement about learning itself. The more traditional responses of rewards and punishments, carrots and sticks, not only fail to do that, but often undermine the very things we're trying to promote in the long term.
Well, thank you, Alfie. We've got to leave it there. I guess I'm not convinced that these things are mutually exclusive. Much bigger conversation, but I do appreciate you joining me this
And
week.
I hope you'll find some of the research and examples in the books will provide you with the evidence you need to show why they, in fact, do tend to pull in opposite directions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for sharing your theories with us. Again, his books are Unconditional Parenting and Punished by Rewards. Thank you again for joining me, Alfie.
My pleasure.
All right. My next guest is an award-winning science journalist, and she's an author of a new book. I love the title, called How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. Okay, Melinda. Her name is Melinda Wiener Moyer. Good morning, Melinda. I get so excited about the title of your book, I forgot to say your name.
Thank you, Areva. I'm very excited too. It comes out tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. So you were listening to Alfie. Alfie has some unconventional, I should say, parenting, messages. He says they're backed up by research and science. I'm sitting here having raised kids, three, not finished, but two who are on their way to law school, and I told them I loved them and I was proud of them. So I'm feeling pretty good as a parent. Tell me, from your research, what are you thinking about rewards and punishment?
Yes. So it's really interesting because I've changed my opinion on rewards in recent years. I used to, so I have two kids. I have a 10-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. And when my son was a little younger, he was having some behavioral issues, and we took him to see a psychologist, and we talked to the psychologist about ways we could help him. And he had suggested setting up a kind of a points system that was essentially a reward system. And every time my son would do something that we appreciated or was polite or kind, we would give him 1 point, which would mean 1 cent towards his allowance or 1 minute of screen time. And we used it for a while, and we did see his behavior really improve very quickly. But then I started digging into the research, and because I'd seen some headlines saying, including Alfie Kohn's book, saying rewards are not good, and so now I have a more nuanced opinion. I think that sometimes when kids really just don't want to do something, I think rewards can be helpful for getting them to do things they really don't want to do. But at the same time, there is really convincing research suggesting that if you reward your kids regularly for something, they feel controlled, they feel kind of manipulated by you, and that kind of spills over into their enjoyment of whatever activity they're doing. And it ultimately does undermine their intrinsic motivation for doing that thing. And we did start seeing some kind of worrying things in our son. He would say, we would ask him to clean, or I guess we would ask him to pick up something he dropped. And he would say, well, I'm not going to do that unless I get a point for it, And so, yeah, they're
manipulating the point system, huh?
Exactly. So I am on board with rewards. They're okay to use sometimes, but I don't think that they're all that constructive in the long run. But I do praise my kids. I think it's impossible sometimes not to. When my daughter makes a drawing and she shows it to me, I'm not just going to say, great. I'm going to say, that's lovely.
I don't know. And obviously, I'm not a developmental psychologist, but I've raised 3 kids, 1 with special needs, 2 who are on their way to Ivy League law schools. And I just think parents got to find what works for their kids. There's going to be a lot of research out there. And a lot of parents, I don't want people to leave the show thinking, oh my God, everything they've done is horrible. They can't praise their kids. They can't put their kids in timeout. You've got to know your kid, do the research, figure out what works best for your family. Because this isn't parenting. One thing I do know, and I don't think you need to be a scientist to know this, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work. And kids, even within a family, different kids are motivated by different things. What may work with one of your children is not going to work. And my kids, all 3 of them, are completely different. So I don't know. I just feel like I need to say that because I don't want my parents who watch this show are going to be like going crazy. And I know my Black parents are going to be saying, like, this is some far out there stuff for white kids. Show us the research with Black kids who are growing up dealing with whether they're going to get shot by the police every day. So here's my caveat. Find what works for your family and follow that. So let me get back to your book. What motivated the book and what motivated this incredible title?
Yes. So, gosh, this was a few years ago now. I was just getting increasingly frustrated and concerned about the behavior I was seeing all around me among some high-profile political figures, and I knew that my kids were being exposed to this. I knew that we don't watch a lot of news on TV together as a family, but nevertheless, the things that Trump was saying, the things that he was doing, I knew my kids were hearing about this, and I was really worried about what impact it would have on them. And it kind of just occurred. It dawned on me one day that really, the most important thing that I thought as a parent that I wanted for my kids was for them to not grow up to be assholes. I don't know if I can say that on. Okay. All right. I just did not want them to grow up to be terrible people. And I started talking with other parents, and they said, we feel that way too, just seeing what's going on around us and seeing all the bad examples and all the bad behavior with everyone, with Me Too, Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby. And everybody was thinking, I think, we just want our kids to grow up to be good people and make the world a better place. And so that's essentially what motivated the book.
Give us some secrets. Give us like the top 3 things that a parent can do that will help their kids not grow up to be like those a-hole kids that some of these people you've named. Obviously, they didn't become a-hole adults. Probably they were a-hole kids that turned into a-hole adults. So, what are the top things we can do?
Well, actually, a lot of what you just talked about with Dr. Vitrip's work, I cite her work. I have a whole chapter on raising kids to be anti-racist. And so certainly talking to kids, I think one of the big themes of the book is that it's really important to talk to kids about uncomfortable and difficult topics. So that includes race, it includes sexism, it includes sex and pornography. I mean, these are really complex topics that kids need a lot of help navigating and understanding. And I think parents are often, afraid that their kids are too young or they're too innocent to have these conversations, but we should be having them early and often. And that can really, the way that we share our values with our kids is through the conversations we have with them. So we really should be talking about the things that make us uncomfortable. So that's one big thing. And then one other really big theme of the book, it kept popping up in the research I was looking at on very different topics, was talking to kids about feelings and letting kids have the feelings they have, acknowledging their feelings, validating their feelings is really powerful for helping kids develop the ability to take other people's perspectives. And that really helps them become more generous and kind. There's really interesting research that suggests that the more parents talk about feelings, the more helpful and kind their kids become, because it's like that helps them understand other people's feelings and help other people when they're, feeling sad or bad. It also, talking about feelings has been linked to a reduced risk for sexual harassment. So boys, if you talk to boys about feelings, this actually ultimately lowers the chance that they're going to sexually harass girls and commit sexual assault. And I think it again comes down to really, helping kids understand themselves, helping kids, not sort of hide away their feelings, but manage them, recognize them, and become comfortable with them. And that helps them just behave so much better and be kinder people.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about communicating with your kids. I was watching a movie actually last night, and this girl, I don't know, she's maybe 7 or 8 years old, asked her parents about one of her aunts and uncles who were getting a divorce. And her younger brother, like 3 or 4, said, "What's a divorce?" And the parents got all nervous and they didn't know what to say. And then the 7 or 8-year-old just gave like the textbook definition of divorce and went on to say, it's when 2 parents can't get along, they decide to break up, they fight over the kids, they fight over property. And the parents are sitting there with their mouths, hanging open because the 7 or 8-year-old could, tell the parents and the 3-year-old what a divorce is. And oftentimes, we forget that our kids know so much. And by not talking to them about a subject doesn't mean they're not talking about it. Doesn't mean that they don't know about it. Oftentimes they're having those conversations with their friends. And so one of the things that my husband and I did really early on is we talked to our kids about everything. We are business owners. And so if we were having issues in our business, we talked to them about business and, the ups and downs of being an entrepreneur, being, business owners. We talked to them about family issues. And it's amazing now that how in tune they are with issues. So yeah, parents, you think you're hiding something from your kids, trust me, they already know. What in your research, what's some of the worst behavior that you think our kids have today, having been exposed to all of this Trump behavior, and now these Trump people who want to be mini Trumps, so it's, even though he's not the president, we see these people who are popping up who are gaining national recognition, exhibiting some of those same behaviors. So what are you seeing in our kids today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first I want to say, I think there's no such thing as a perfectly behaved kid. Kids have to make mistakes in order to learn from them. And a lot of what we consider, good, acceptable behavior is rooted in cultural norms that they have to learn. They're not born knowing that handshake, you shake someone's hand. Well, I guess now we don't shake hands anymore, but these kinds of things are not instinctual. They have to be taught. So I think, kids are kind of supposed to break the rules a lot in order to learn. But what really struck me, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, was I was digging into the literature on, hate crimes and bullying and what was happening in our country. And a lot of it was really increasing a lot after Trump was elected, right around the time of the election. Actually, the Southern Poverty Law Center surveyed a lot of teachers all around the country about what they were seeing in schools. And they were seeing so many, hate crimes and hate language, and a lot of it was borrowed from Trump's own words, people saying, a lot of things that he had said, some of it I don't really want to repeat. But so there has been an effect, kids really have absorbed what he has said. And so I was seeing this, and I was seeing all of the data showing that these hate crimes were increasing even in kids. And I thought, this is a reason to write this book.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for writing it. Again, the book is How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. Your work is inspiring. I love the title, and I love so many of the chapters, and I'm glad you tackled the whole issue of how to raise kids who are anti-racist. So needed, particularly in this moment that we're in. Good luck with the book. And again, thank you for sitting down with me this morning.
Thank you, Areva. My pleasure.
All right. Thanks to all of my guests, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. I know you got a lot of comments and questions. I'm going to get to all of them. Trust me, I always do. It's interesting. You need a license to drive a car, practice law, practice medicine, fly a plane even, but not to have a kid. Anybody can have children, either through biology, technology, adoption, so many ways that you can become a parent. But unfortunately, no guidebooks. You don't get pregnant and someone gives you a big binder and say, hey, this is what you're going to need. Or, you don't find out you're going to be a parent and, someone comes along with a great big book. Many people just wing it. They do what their parents did. They do what their grandparents did. They do what their friends did. They just kind of figure out. And unfortunately, we make a lot of mistakes as parents. We end up having to say we're sorry to our kids, which is okay. Most of us figure it out as we go. And a lot of us have been really fortunate to raise kids that we're proud to say are, not just smart and hardworking, but kids who are compassionate and kind and who care about other people and care about the universe. And they're going to go out and do something to make the world a better place. So don't despair, parents. Don't beat yourself up if you're not doing a lot of the things that our experts talked about today. You still have time. You're never done parenting, even when your kids are in their 30s and 40s and 50s. I love to see, parents who are in their 80s fawn over their 60-year-old kids. So parenting is a lifelong endeavor, and it's one of the greatest gifts, I think, from God is to be a parent. Just some words to live by before I get out. A child is going to remember who was there, not what was spent on them. Kids outgrow toys, they outgrow outfits, they outgrow all kinds of, gadgets and material things, but they never outgrow time, and they never outgrow our love. So love on your kids today, and, do the best you can as parents. And if you need help, don't ever think it's a bad idea to get help. Friends, neighbors, even professionals can help you, but the key is love your kids. I'm safe. I'm out, y'all. You be safe out there. Wear your mask, and remember, we're all in this together.